Marie, thank you very much. Before you run out of this room, I just have to admit to all of you, I have a tiny little crush on Marie Bruno. She is, let me tell you something, she's a local hero. And not just because she's Bill Clinton's cousin, but she is charging the way on dealing with this complicated issue right here in Arkansas, and she's taking that experience to the national level as well. So Marie, thank you for everything you're doing, and thank you for that introduction. Skip Rutherford, thank you very much for having me here today. I am going to talk to you a little bit about maybe three things. First thing I want to remember, though, is, Marie, I'm going to remember this. You can't win a pissing match with a skunk.
That's right.
That is,
Can't win a pissing match with a skunk.
that's a great saying, and I think that's a great saying to bring to Washington, D.C. Especially today, perhaps, with what's going on, which we can come back and talk a little bit about. But what I thought I would do today is to tell you a little bit more about the problem of adult literacy in the United States and around the globe. Tell you a little bit about the work of pro-literacy and what we're trying to do to fix the problem. Tell you a little bit about my own background and where I come from and how I ended up where I am. And then really I want to spend most of our time today hearing a little bit about your thoughts, your questions, so that we can get a discussion going. These are very interesting times, aren't they? And the first thing that I want to suggest to all of you is that part of the financial crisis that we're experiencing today, particularly related to the subprime mortgage problem, is related to literacy, financial literacy. How many people signed up for mortgages that they didn't understand what they were signing because they don't have adequate literacy skills? That is a big component of this problem. How many of us may have signed up for mortgages that we didn't understand what we were signing either? These are very complicated things, made obviously many more times complicated if you cannot adequately read and write and do basic math. So, a little bit more about the problem of adult literacy in the United States. The population of people who cannot read and write in the United States is a shocking number. 30 million adults over the age of 16 in the United States are at a below basic literacy level, which means they have trouble reading stop signs. They have trouble understanding the price of things in grocery stores, and they cannot read an everyday label on a package. That's a major problem. The problem doesn't end there. There are another 60 million on top of that in the United States that function at the next grade of measuring this problem, which is basic literacy. And that is not an adequate level for functioning in today's society, particularly in this global economy. The way the rating system works in this area is that the following categories are generally used, both here in the United States and internationally. Below basic, basic, intermediate, which most experts say is the level that you must get to if you're going to have any level of proficiency in reading, writing, and doing basic math. From there, you go on to a category called proficient. These are the categories that are used both here in the United States and around the world. So here in the United States, just to repeat once again, 30 million are below basic, and 60 million are at a basic level of literacy. That is an enormous problem. 90 million U.S. adults. The population falls roughly into a third. A third relating to learning disabilities that get undiagnosed in the school systems. A third relates to immigration and adults who come to the United States who may not be literate in their native languages and are in need of English language skills. And a third relates to failing schools, dare I say, and adults who drop out of school. That's roughly the population in the United States. Today, we have a variety of federal programs that try to remediate this problem. The first and foremost one that is a focus to my organization is a program called the Workforce Investment Act. Now you might ask, literacy, workforce. that characterization of literacy in the context of workforce training and literacy was a framework that was foisted on this field by a Republican-controlled House of Representatives in the 90s when legislation was considered to renew a program called the Adult and Family Literacy Act. That program is now part of this overall program called the Workforce Investment Act. Very important set of issues in terms of literacy and workforce training, but not the only way to describe this issue and the needs that people have. One of the things that my organization is currently looking at is how do we change that as we go forward, particularly at this time when Congress will be renewing legislation next year, and we may think about actually decoupling that. But we can come back and talk a little bit more about that at a later point. Globally, 1 billion people illiterate. That term illiteracy is used a little bit more commonly internationally than it is domestically. But internationally, about 1 billion people cannot read or write or do basic math. Obviously, an enormous problem internationally. This issue of literacy, all the research shows, is at the heart of many of the social problems we are trying to tackle in our country and around the globe right now. And you know better than I, because you're out there doing programs and practicums and working at the local level with organizations as part of your program here. But literacy really cuts to the core of some of the problems that we're trying to fix. For me, I came out of having worked about 14 years in the AIDS community. I led and helped to found a national AIDS organization, which was called AIDS Alliance for Children, Youth, and Families. And we, like pro-literacy, represented pediatric AIDS clinics from around the United States. Really unbeknownst to me, we had a health literacy program. There's another specialty in the field of literacy. And our health literacy program was focused on accepting women from around the country who were living with HIV, who could not read and write adequately, bringing them to a basic level of proficiency, and then teaching them about the healthcare system, about the disease of HIV, what was happening in their bodies, and then how to navigate the healthcare system. And then we sent the women back to their local communities to reach other women and get them into the healthcare system. Those are the classic elements of a health literacy program. I didn't even know it at the time. Started talking to pro-literacy and realized, whoa, very powerful connection here to be made between trying to solve problems like HIV and AIDS, trying to solve problems of the crime rate in America. All of these issues are interrelated with literacy. We know that if we can improve an adult's literacy skills, we are making inroads to solving all these other problems. The healthcare system, huge costs to the healthcare system for people who cannot read and write. Think about it. They can't read a prescription drug label. They may not be taking their prescription drugs correctly for themselves or their kids if they're taking care of kids. It's an enormous cost to the healthcare system. The same is true for workforce training. Go into any of the major corporations in America, Pitney Bowes, Walmart, Tyson's Foods, and you will find the executives will tell you literacy is a major problem for their workforce. And what many of the companies have done in this country is to, in essence, create their own training and literacy programs to bring their workforce to a certain skill level so they can do things like run cash registers, help supply the shelves, and handle the day-to-day needs of a service industry. Walmart is a case in point. They estimate up to 60 to 70% of their employees are not literate. They have to form a whole system of pictures to help their staff get basic tasks done. You don't hear too much about the companies talking about that publicly, but you get them to talk about things off the record and talk about what the costs are to their day-to-day business, and they will tell you what the shocking statistics are. So again, connecting the dots between this issue and worker productivity, costs to American corporations, costs to the healthcare system, not the least of which to mention is the position that the United States is or is not in in a globally competitive marketplace, which, as we all know as we speak, current financial crisis, we are learning every day just how interrelated we are to economies and the banking system around the world. It's a little bit of an overview of the issue. I could go on and on about this, but I won't. I'm going to pause there. Talk a little bit more when we come back to questions and answers. My own background. I'll tell you a little bit about that. I came to pro-literacy in kind of a roundabout way. My own background is that I started out in Washington, D.C., working in Congress, worked for a member of Congress from Connecticut, Sam Gadenson. Some of you might remember him. Really good liberal Democrat. Got booted out of Congress. The Republicans took over the House in the second term of the Clinton administration. But I started out my career working on the Hill as a legislative assistant, staff assistant, and hated it. Absolutely hated it. But I'll tell you, I learned a lot about the legislative process, which has helped my career and my own work ever since. That was the year 1984. I went to Washington after I spent a year working in London for a member of Parliament. I like being in London a little bit more than I like being in Washington. Being in London was a fantastic experience for all the reasons all of you know, just getting out of the States, seeing and hearing other perspectives, but also comparing the form of government, a parliamentary form of government, with the U.S. democratic system was a really fascinating experience. From there, I went to work after leaving the Hill, on health and disability issues. Got into, during the era of the late 1980s, confronting issues about kids with HIV getting thrown out of the public school system. Some of you will remember that. The Robert Ray family, Ryan White, all of which, well, those cases were extreme, but the Ray family got burned out of their home, state of Florida. Ryan White got thrown out of public schools, which, as it turns out, of course, are illegal acts. You cannot do that. But at the time, there was a lot of hysteria in the country in the late 80s around HIV and AIDS. And the work that I got involved with was, again, to connect the dots between social policy. How are kids with HIV regarded as having a disability? And how do disability legal protections, federal laws, and disability programs themselves, how can they serve kids with HIV to prevent this type of thing happening at the local level? So I got involved with that issue, did some legal research, publishing around some of those issues, although I'm not a lawyer. I am a social worker by training. Got a master's in social work after I went to the Hill. And then at that point went and helped to found AIDS Alliance for Children, Youth, and Families. Was not looking for a job. A year and a half ago, Pro-Literacy came calling, sent me a beautiful packet of materials. I don't know if any of you have dealt with headhunting firms. Very suspicious of headhunting firms, but this one stood out a little bit. Read it, put it in a stack of papers for about 2 months, and then they called me up, and 7 interviews later, I decided to go to Pro-Literacy. The reason I went to Pro-Literacy, again, is this issue goes to the heart of what I think many of you have an interest in learning about and studying and getting involved with, which is why you've chosen to come to the Clinton School. But I wanted to get involved with this issue because I became convinced this issue is nowhere on the national radar screen. There is roughly $500 million allocated to serve what is a potential population of 90 million Americans. With $500 million, we are only touching less than 5% of the population that needs adult basic education and literacy services in the United States. That is atrocious. Compare that response by Congress and the federal government with the response that we see in other sectors, AIDS being one case example. The Ryan White Care Act, which is a piece of legislation that I worked on for about 10 to 15 years, through 3 reauthorizations in Congress, is funded at $2.2 billion for a population that is between 500,000 and 1 million. Now, I do not mean to directly compare a health problem like AIDS against an adult literacy problem. The comparisons are not perfect. Healthcare services are extremely expensive, particularly for people with HIV. But it is a case in point about the differences in how our government responds to social issues based on the advocacy response, based on the mobilization of people to take to the streets and talk to their elected officials about problems. And that translates into real dollars getting allocated. That has not happened in this arena for whatever reason, the adult literacy field. The adult literacy field is an old field, been around 40 to 50 years in terms of the system that we see organized around the United States. And yet, this is an issue and a field and a group of people who are working at the local level across the country who, in my view, never really figured out how to scratch Washington, D.C. and make some things happen in terms of a lot more money coming into the field and getting legislative initiatives passed. So I took this job, perhaps naively, thinking maybe I can make a difference here. Taking the experience from the disability and the health field, from the AIDS community, and translating what in essence has been very successful social movements and trying to bring some of that experience and expertise to the issue of adult literacy. So I've been on the job for a year, loving it. A lot more challenges than I probably anticipated. My job as president and CEO, of course, is to oversee what is not a small organization, but not a huge organization either, and a little bit about pro-literacy worldwide. We are a national and international organization. Our budget's about $13 million a year. Half of the budget is a publishing operation called New Readers Press. We publish instructional materials that we sell throughout the country and around the world, about 150 titles. Half the organization then, separate from the publishing operation, is focused to kind of classic programs and services that you see in any national association. We serve the constituency of adult literacy programs around the United States that numbers about 1,200 local programs, with Marie Bruno, her agency, and the network that she serves here in Arkansas being one of those constituent groups. So we do training and technical assistance, and we do this work as well around the globe. We help to support programs through small grants in 65 developing countries. And there are opportunities for some of you who are interested in this to be doing work in this arena globally, as well as here in the United States. We need all the help we can get, I'll tell you. But pro-literacy has, as an organization, has been around about 40 to 50 years. We are the merged organization of two predecessor groups, one of whom some of you may remember. The Literacy Volunteers of America, founded in Syracuse, New York in 1961. Law-Back Literacy International, founded in the 50s in Syracuse, New York. How many of you knew the adult literacy movement was founded in Syracuse, New York? I didn't. But I now live in Syracuse, New York, so I can tell you a little bit about what it's like to live in the North Country. Beautiful part of the world. But the two organizations merged about 5 or 6 years ago to form Pro-Literacy Worldwide. And so today we are the merged organization of the two predecessor groups who have a very long and successful track record. Literacy Volunteers of America was founded by a woman named Ruth Colvin, who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom last year for her accomplishments. She was really instrumental in developing the model of getting volunteers to come to local programs to be volunteer tutors. Volunteers that provide adult literacy services within our programs around the country constitute a huge dollar value for the way the system is currently serving adults. The other organization was founded by a missionary, congregational minister missionary by the name of Frank Laubach. And Frank Laubach basically pioneered the modern day adult literacy teaching methods in the 1930s in the Philippines, and then brought that experience back to the United States, founded an organization that got going in the 40s and 50s, and obviously is still active today in the context of our organization. Ruth Colvin and Frank Laubach were prolific writers. They wrote some of the earliest and best regarded instructional materials designed for community folks. They did not write their materials from an academic perspective. Lots of writing around this issue, obviously, from the education community. But Ruth Colvin and Frank Laubach wrote materials that were in the context of trying to reach people in their everyday lives. And these materials that they wrote continue to be some of our best sellers through our publishing business today, which is quite something. If any of you understand or track the publishing world these days, publishing world's taken quite a hit with the digital age and the internet, and our publishing operation too. But it's a testament, I think, to some of the power of their early work in terms of the work that pro-literacy helps to support by disseminating their materials. So, that's my overview, an introduction to who I am, what pro-literacy is about, a little bit about the issue of adult literacy, and I think what I'd like to do now is just open it up for comments, thoughts, questions. I will tell you this before I do that it's been thrilling to kind of learn a little bit about the Clinton School. I'll tell you, if I was a lot younger than I was right now, I would love to be coming to a program like this. I got a master's in social work, but what I ended up doing through my own interests and career path is doing essentially what you are studying here in this program and the work that you're doing in local programs. In my view, the Masters of Public Service program kind of combines the best of what I have come to appreciate as community organizing in the social work profession, which is a very old kind of theoretical model around how you support local communities. Community development has taken a few knocks, as you all may know, in this election cycle, with Barack Obama getting knocked for being a community organizer, very unfortunately. So community organizing, social work, a focus on public policy, advocacy, grassroots developments. It seems to me these are the best aspects of what you get the wonderful privilege of having to be able to study here at the local level and then put that right into practice. So it's great. I salute you for doing this work. So what questions you want to throw at me or thoughts? Oh, okay. Let's start all the way in the back and then we'll come forward. Yes?
My name is Nicholas Hall. I'm a student here at the school. And my question is, we've been reading a little bit about death penalty cases and things like that, and how the mental capacity of inmates on death row is way below the average. And so I was wondering some of the steps your organization takes to work within the prison system to educate criminals.
Very good question. Some studies estimate that the prison population, 60 to 70% or higher in some communities. The prison population, 60 to 70% rates of illiteracy, below basic proficiency in reading, writing, and math. The relationship between educational attainment and criminal activity is huge. So what are we doing about it? Many of our local programs that we support around the country do literacy programs in correctional institutions. What you find is that they have a differing track record based on the state or the local community. Some correctional institutions welcome people to come in and provide these services. Some correctional institutions do not. And so it's a really mixed track record as you move across the country. I think that there's a lot of success to be shown for those institutions that have some of these services in place, that the recidivism rate of people leaving prison and then ending back up in prison because of criminal, you lower that. You have prisoners who leave the prison system, incarcerated adults who are contributing back to their local communities when they get out. They're becoming much more self-sustaining. There's a lot of success to be shown for these programs. However, it is mostly the case that many of these programs are still volunteer-driven. One of our priorities has to be, I think, to get the federal government to step up to the plate and put more money into this. That is a much easier thing said than done. but it is going to be one of our agendas as we move forward in Washington. Let me also say that pro-literacy has never had a Washington office before. We have just opened a Washington office. We will be posting a job announcement for a Director of Policy and Government Affairs. Some of you may be graduating soon, looking for a job in Washington. We're going to be looking to hire somebody who can really take the lead on our work in D.C. There is not a single adult literacy organization in America that has a full-time staff presence in Washington. So we will be the first group to do it. That's what it takes to impact on stuff in D.C. Other questions? Moving from the back to the forward. Yes?
I'm Georgia Mears, and I'm the Executive Director of Our House here in Little Rock. We provide job training, adult basic education, and GED prep for about 1,000 homeless adults who want to enter the workforce.
You ought to be up here talking.
My question is that we have found, even through your organization, great resources on how to teach adults once they're in the door, but the real challenge is getting them in the door. So I wanted to hear from you about some best practices that you've seen nationally or even globally about overcoming those challenges, which range from financial to personal challenges to just past experience challenges. And especially with your social work background, I'm really interested in what you have to say about that.
Well, let's see if I can say something interesting. Well, I have a couple things to say. First, we haven't done much on that issue. And obviously, it's essentially what you just said. What we need as a field is programs that fight stigma. And this is something that I think there's a lot of awareness about in the adult literacy field. A part of the problem that fuels this issue is the stigma that adults experience in terms of coming forward and admitting that they have a problem with reading and writing. What I've not seen in the year that I've spent working with this field is kind of a borrowing of what we have seen in the public health field, for example, which is social marketing campaigns that are designed to break down some of those barriers that people experience because of stigma. I mean, thinking about AIDS, which is a perfect case in point, we see the federal government investing a lot of money in anti-stigma campaigns using social marketing principles from the public health field, which of course ultimately come from the corporate sector. It's a borrowing of marketing principles from the corporate sector and trying to apply that to the behavioral, to the health and the behavioral fields through public health. We've not done much of that in the adult literacy field. I was really struck by that when I first started learning about this issue. And I think we've got to make some of those connections and borrow from allied health professionals who have very well-developed models here. Now, in the public health field, we're not doing so well at preventing things like HIV and AIDS. And for those of you who have followed that issue, particularly domestically, in the last year alone, the federal government has come out and admitted that they've been undercounting the rates of new HIV infections in the United States by 25% in the last 10 years, which is kind of mind-boggling, but it's true. And so the debate that's playing out right now in the AIDS community, which then translates into the public policy and political worlds of Washington, is, does it make sense to invest in prevention programs and anti-stigma campaigns? I mean, I would argue it does. I would argue that without the investment that we've had in the past, we'd have a much worse epidemic than what we do today in the United States. But making those links speaks to, I think, a thing I've been trying to sound here, which is to place adult literacy in the context of other social problems, which again, the adult literacy field may not have been so good at. Folks in the education field, really bright, talented folks, but like you see in many other sectors, you get a little bit narrow sometimes, focusing in on, well, let's come up with the best teaching methods possible to reach adults. What's harder is to think a little bit more broadly based, which is what I dare say your program is all about here at the Clinton School, and what my own academic training was in the social work profession. But to think broad-based in terms of systemic solutions to problems, and making the connections between these social issues and borrowing the best that allied professions have to offer us in the adult literacy field. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I am admitting that, you know, you're right on the money.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up, because you didn't touch on this, is the incentive question. What is the balance between incentives that you know, federally, you know, the wage programs, the Workforce Investment Act programs have included some incentives for participants? And what is the balance between providing incentives to get people in the door or just expecting that they would see the value?
Would you like to come to Washington?
She's good, you ought to hire her.
That's a very good point. And it's funny you mention the issue of incentives, because what I've been helping pro-literacy and the adult literacy field to do, I dare say for the first time, is to get going on our work in Washington. And one of the first baby steps that we are taking is to rally the field to come together and have a consensus on what we believe should be a set of public policy principles that would guide legislative action. It sounds really simple, but it's really important. And to get a national movement focused around like 7 sets of principles that define how the field should be structured, how resources should be used in the best way possible, how incentives might be structured within the system to get people to come in the door and to stick with the program and to continue from the below basic level all the way through post-secondary education. Incentives is one of the things that has come through as we have embarked on this process. And if any of you are coming to our annual conference that's here in Little Rock, which starts tomorrow, I am doing a two-hour town hall meeting on Thursday morning in which a major focus of our discussion will be on these policy principles. And it talks a lot about incentives. But there's no reason why the federal government cannot be structuring the way money flows through the Adult and Family Literacy Act and the Workforce Investment Act to create some incentives, both for the adult learners and the providers in terms of rewards for success. So I'm really glad you asked that question. It was very good. Okay, let's come here, then we'll come to this side of the room. Yes, ma'am.
You started to touch on this in your previous answer to the first question. I'm wondering, what are the specific efforts we're doing to actually get this on the radar? I know that you said you're adding a Washington office. What is pro-literacy doing, and what do you see as a strategy for getting this on the national radar?
That's a really good question. You guys are a sharp group. What am I doing? Well, let me start out with saying the following. I was on the job 5 weeks last fall when we went into our annual conference. And our annual conference happened to be in Washington, D.C., which was very lucky for me. My hometown, I've been there 24 years, knew the Hill, and we spent a certain amount of time going to the Hill. But one of the first things I said to everybody was, you know, you adult literacy folks are so nice. You're just so nice. They're just really nice people. You know, what I think is one of the key elements of creating a social movement and propelling people to action in the political arena is something that I'm calling constructive anger. It's nice to be nice. It's nice to, you know, and there couldn't be a better, more compassionate, dedicated, wonderful group of people who have long worked in the adult literacy field. But they are so nice. And you do not win things in Washington, D.C. by being nice. That's the understatement of the century, isn't it? But you all know better than I. You really have to have constructive anger. You have to be mobilized at the grassroots level. You have to empower adult learners themselves, the quote-unquote consumers, the consumers of the services themselves, to speak up on their behalf and to speak to the policymakers. It is not going to be people like me who wear a blue suit and tie every day and takes to the halls of Congress that are really going to turn the situation around with policymakers. It's the adult learners who go in and tell their stories about what these programs have meant for their lives, the success that they've had through these programs, which will make policymakers to do the right thing in Washington. So what I've been trying to do in the last year is to put some of those elements in place. And this isn't rocket science, and it's not unique. Take a look at the AIDS movement. Take a look at the breast cancer movement. Take a look at any of a constituency group that has managed to organize themselves because they know the importance of doing that within our system of government to make a difference. So we're starting a advocacy day in Washington this next May. We're going to do it every year. That's never happened before. I have empowered adult learners to take a bigger role in our organization in terms of the governance structure of the organization. We have changed the messages for how we describe what we do, using new and different words, and always including adult learners in our language. We are going to be doing a lot of work around creating tools to educate people about how this works. So today, we launched a new website, www.proliteracy.org. It's a fabulous new website, if I may say so myself. And it's got some brand new capacities on it. We had kind of a, dare I say, a kind of outmoded website that was very, you probably know it. Just a little staid. But we have a new one up and running today. There's a new pro-literacy website, and there's a new website for our publishing business, newreaderspress.com. They're interrelated on the web. But big focus on kind of better educational materials about advocacy and public policy and media awareness. We've added a CapWiz program, which is an advocacy program. You can hit a button and send a message to your member of Congress like that, not having to research a name, a number, a fax number, and you don't even have to write a letter. Just you can send the message that we write for people to send. So that's what I would point to in terms of some of the basic things that we're trying to put in place, which we will build upon. Over here, sir.
Friends of mine had a company called Concept Learning Center a number of years ago here in Arkansas. It had individual booths where they could learn off a disc and things like that, and a variety of subjects. But they found that the main constituency they had were people coming in there who have been faking it for years. The fact that they haven't learned to read, did not know how to read, but they could do it. They came there because they could do it anonymously, not affecting their job or anything else. So that's
Right.
a very important component, I think.
Confidentiality.
Yes.
Yes, yes, I agree. Let me also say that it is people develop amazing coping skills. And some of those amazing stories I've heard is from adult learners themselves who manage to figure out how to get through the system and never telling anybody they can't read and write. And it's pretty amazing stuff. It speaks to the resilience and the brain power the adult learners have. Some of whom have a learning disability that never got diagnosed, or were part of a school system that was not up to par. But the coping skills that they develop to get through the system is simply awesome. And it's amazing to think about what can be done with that brain power if you add a few tools and skills to the toolbox. Yes?
I enjoyed being at the National Institute for Literacy and was deputy director during the Clinton campaign.
Oh my gosh.
At the Clinton, and
You ought to be up here talking too.
No, I've been there, done that. But one of the things about advocacy that I think we discovered then and is going on today is that literacy is a whisper issue. Yeah, AIDS is easy to talk about. There are a lot of issues that are easy to talk about, but what we found is that if you start admitting the national literacy issue, it's an admission of failure for governors, for superintendents, for school systems, and so we can't get past, even with the Clinton administration, as much as he pushed literacy, it was something we had to really dance around delicately. So that I think really goes to the issue in a real pointed way. That if we could, I think if you could put together a coalition of governors, teachers associations, superintendent associations, somebody to help craft a message that would speak for the education industry, we might get somewhere. Another issue that we confronted was prison. Incarcerated people can play basketball and watch TV all day, but there's not a law that requires an incarcerated person to be in an educational program in prison. It's a policy matter. It's a simple little law that needs to be passed, that if you're incarcerated and you're eligible for parole, you must be in a program that'll at least get you through to GED. And prison officials will say, oh, we don't have room. But so it's going to take some creative use of the cafeteria. There's some concerns about safety between the teachers and the inmates, but lots of things like that. And the other thing that we never got off the ground, but would be wonderful, I think, for the May event, would be to have a read-in on the mall with adult learners just filling up the mall, reading at noon or all day and saying, I am an adult learner. And
That's a great idea.
Picture, that snapshot.
Could do a read-in maybe inside the Capitol Hill Rotunda or something. Get all these members of Congress to come back.
One of the stigmas also is the issue of you're a ne'er-do-well, you dropped out for some reason. And what we're trying to get Congress to understand and need to get the public to understand is that while we give a bunch of money to K-12, an investment in an adult learner is a double investment, because when you're educating an adult, you're educating the child. And so many kids go home at night and don't have anybody to help them with homework. So if the adult knew how to read and do math and do some basic writing, that child could overcome. So many children never get past the adult learner problem because they just do like mommy did.
Well, now you're embarrassing me a little bit, because the central reason my organization exists, which I didn't say until now, is that we focus on adult literacy because without the parents, we're never going to solve the problem with kids' performance in schools in the U.S. We're perpetuating a cycle. And that is the whole reason Pro-Literacy Worldwide came to be in existence, because no one was addressing the adult literacy problem. There are lots of organizations that address kids'
We've
issues.
got time for one more question. So, can we visit later? Everybody can have their questions asked. We got time for one more.
Okay, ooh, where do I go? I don't know.
Your call, David.
Me? Skip, why don't you decide? Okay, right here.
Right there.
Oh, maybe two then.
Okay.
Here and here.
Okay, what the heck?
I'm Jennifer Dillahan, the Director of the Center for Health Advancement at the Arkansas Department of Health. I think there is a very strong link between public health and literacy. And you've talked about borrowing from public health, but I'd like to hear more talk about partnering with public health, because literacy is a health skill.
Yes.
And you will find, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but oftentimes adults are motivated to acquire literacy skills because of health reasons. They need them. And then correlated with that is a different area called health literacy, which is not the same as literacy, but literacy is a prerequisite for health literacy. And I think there's wonderful opportunity, particularly in Arkansas, because the health department has over 90 local health units, and we interact often with people who have very low literacy skills, and there's lots of room to use that venue as a entree or a way to link people because they want to build their skills to being healthy.
By the way, let me just add very quickly there too. You know, some of the buzzwords in Washington these days are, you hear a little bit, you know, health literacy, financial literacy, citizenship, workforce training and literacy. We should not be afraid to really use those terms to jump on the bandwagon of issues that are moving in Washington to get attention and resources back to really around what is the core need, which is literacy. And so health literacy is one where we've seen some real action in Congress this past year to introduce legislation. What's at the core of it, though, as you point out, is literacy, but it's using health as the hook and the context for why this issue is important. Because adult literacy in and of itself is not a term or an issue that resonates in Washington. We've got to connect it to the other issues. Yes?
Very quickly, I think that, well, of the 90 million adults that are either at basic or below basic reading levels, you've broken down into 3 groups: learning disabilities, immigration, and the dropouts, people who fail, the failure of the schools, the people who drop out of schools. And those seem to be the 3 issues that affect children in the primary and secondary levels as well. And so as a former educator, I know that the needs of children with learning disabilities are different than the needs of ESL students, and those are different than the needs of kids who are not motivated to learn. And so in your recruitment and training of volunteers, how do you address those different needs, and are there certain areas that are more easily addressed or more feasible to address using volunteers?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure I can adequately answer it. I think we have a long, successful track record of using tutors to make a difference in this field. But I think what we see is that tutors have managed to make the biggest difference with those adults who, for whatever reason, overcome the stigma and they come into the doors and ask for services. And so through tutors, we are reaching a population that needs these services who are motivated for whatever reason to come in the door and ask for help. That's only part of the population, as you just pointed out. There's a whole range of other needs out there where we probably have to be a little bit more systemic, using classroom instructions, working for reforms in public education so that kids with learning disabilities are being properly diagnosed and get access to the services that they need. Immigration reform and really talking openly and honestly about what immigrants who've come to this country, starting with the discussion about legal immigrants in terms of what they need to become citizens. So this is part of the problem of this issue, though. It is really broad-based and complex. And it must take a multi-pronged approach, and it goes beyond just purely the education field, which is why I think we have to make these links. But I don't think I really answered your question adequately, but it is a really important, valid point.
Well, obviously, there's
Thank
a
you.
great deal of interest in this subject. Thank you all for coming. We'll talk David and stay around a little bit before he goes to prepare for his convention. But again, thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.